David Lynch is one of the most well-known American filmmakers of the last several decades, and because of his unique and unorthodox style, has one of the most rabid and dedicated fan bases out there. His films are so different and so far out of any of the ordinary Hollywood conventions that a new adjective was spawned in order to properly nail down the essence of his work: Lynchian.
Yes.
Any piece of film, music, or art described as being Lynchian undoubtedly will draw flocks of people seeking out that specifically strange, dreamlike sensibility. But by the same token, it will repel others who associate David Lynch with being weird for the sake of being weird, or simply being weird for no reason. The fact that Lynch is notoriously adverse to discussing the meanings of his films gives ammunition to anti-Lynch partisans and begs the question, is David Lynch weird for no reason? Before Lynch became the cinematic treasure we know him as today, his primary interest was in painting, not film. He had an interest in painting from an early age, and late into his adolescence, zeroed his focus in on becoming a professional, traveling to Europe with a friend to seek an apprenticeship with the Austrian expressionist painter. When that apprenticeship failed to come to fruition, he applied to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where he'd make his first short films, almost unintentionally stumbling onto cinema, stating that he just saw it as a way to make a moving painting. Lynch's pursuit of film brought him all the way to the AFI Academy in Los Angeles, where he caught the idea that would become his debut feature, Eraserhead. The production of Eraserhead was rough and turbulent, but with a clear vision for the project, Lynch strapped in, and several years later had crafted one of the most successful midnight movies ever, with Eraserhead almost being immediately launched into cult classic status. Lynch has cited expressionist painter Francis Bacon as a strong influence on his style, but with Eraserhead it's evident that Lynch also derived inspiration from the surrealist painting tradition. Without delving too deeply into a synopsis of Eraserhead, we can tell easily from the first scene that we're not in any kind of reality that we're familiar with. Rather, the film takes place in a bleakly nightmarish industrial city. In Lynch's own words, Eraserhead is a dream of dark and troubling things, and in the general consensus opinion is one of, if not the single weirdest film Lynch has ever made. None of the characters resemble any objective level of normalcy. Henry's child is a grotesque monster, and there's a deformed lady living in Henry's radiator. The director's statements and these strange and unnatural events that unfold make us wonder whether the whole thing is a dream in itself. Just when we think things couldn't possibly get any weirder, we're given a peek into Henry's dreams, where we see his head getting lopped off and replaced with the head of his child. Henry's head is then taken to a pencil factory, where his cranial contents are used to manufacture erasers. And I think just about anyone else that sees Eraserhead for the first time is always pretty baffled by this scene, but I think upon several rewatches and a closer inspection of the film's themes, there is some sense to be made out of it, although not exactly any kind of logical sense. In my interpretation, Eraserhead is a movie that expresses the fears and anxieties of premature parenthood in a dark, oppressive, and horrifying fashion. The monstrous appearance of Henry's offspring and its ear-piercing wails communicate that loud and clear. The woman in the radiator singing about how in heaven everything is fine represents a blissful way for Henry to escape his horror of being a parent, an escape that leads to heaven. Obviously, there are many more interpretations and much more to be unpacked, but just this cursory glance at the themes gives us enough material to possibly decipher the eraser production in the factory as representing Henry's intense desire to erase the mistake he made that left him in this current situation. This interpretation may not be entirely what Lynch had floating around in his mind when making the film, but if we for a moment assume that it is indeed correct, then Henry's dream has succeeded in using surreal symbolism and imagery to visually communicate Henry's stormy mental state. Not only did it succeed in this cinematic communication, but did a far more effective job than any stale line of dialogue or anything grounded in reality could possibly have. And I believe the reason why is because the imagery is so striking and so eccentric and weird that it burrows under our skin and nestles in our subconscious without our permission. Eraserhead is littered with plot points and symbols that unsettle us in a similar fashion, and I truly believe that it's one of the reasons why it has remained such a cult classic for so many decades. It reminds us of our own dreams and the countless times we've woken up reeling in the morning or the middle of the night trying to recall the quickly fleeting details of the strange dream we've just had. These thematic connections Lynch capitalizes on make sense, but not any logical or reasonable sense. Lynch and a good deal of his films operate on a kind of dream logic. The great filmmaker Werner Herzog once said that film is not the art of the scholar, but of the illiterates. In the most visual of mediums, Lynch uses the dream and the fantasy to externally show a character's internal conflict in a way that is both engaging and memorable. It is important to note, however, that the manipulation of dreams and fantasies aren't the one and only definition of Lynchian, just one of the strengths. Humor is also a sizable force in Lynch's directing style. We see great examples of that in nearly all of his works, and it plays off his surreal approach in a way that balances the darkness.
Yes, but only one has a best friend with one arm. Harry? In the heat of the
When Lynch is on his A game, he can be incredibly funny. But just as that humor offsets the oppressive darkness, it sets us up for another side of Lynch. Not the necessarily dark side, but the uncanny side that can scare us and fill us with a palpable sense of dread. While Lynch's films are never really traditional horrors, he borrows a good amount from the horror playbook. If he sets us up for humor or tragedy, we may think we pretty much know what we're in for, and that's when we fall into the trap he's laid for us.
Are you sure?
Of course. As a matter of fact, I'm there right now.
Perhaps the best and certainly the most well-known example of this comes in his 2001 film Mulholland Drive, the Winky's diner scene. In this scene, two men meet for breakfast at a diner, and one tells the other about a nightmare he had that took place in the back of the very same diner. It ends with an encounter with a horrifying figure. So, when he recounts his dream, the two men go to the back of the diner to investigate, and these sudden flashes of horrific imagery and subtle jump scares catch us off guard, but simultaneously keeps us glued to the screen. The two men in the Winky's diner scene serve virtually no other use in the plot, and only one of them is ever seen again. When the film ends, we realize that the bum character served as a kind of extreme juxtaposition to Diane's glamorous but fabricated dream life. But we still may find ourselves scratching our heads at why the scene existed at all, and the seemingly arbitrary weirdness of it all. There are some interesting, deeper interpretations out there, but from a strictly filmmaking perspective, a scene like this unsettles us deeply. It keeps us alert and on our toes while maintaining our curiosity. And when the horror is over, we feel a looming, foreboding sense of dread envelop us. Lynch strikes while the iron is hot, throwing more puzzling, cryptic imagery and scenes at us, and our lack of initial understanding only heightens the dread as we realize anything can happen. Through his subtle scares and strange, otherworldly sound design, Lynch capitalizes on the greatest fear of all, the unknown. The unknown draws a good amount of fear, but also intrigue and mystery. Lynch is notorious for flat-out refusing to explain the meanings of his often cryptic films. His tight-lipped policy doesn't work so well in the internet age, when anyone stumped by a Lynch film can just search it on YouTube. But it does mean that none of the interpretations will ever be confirmed by Lynch himself. You might think to yourself that this does very little to keep the mystery of his films encapsulated, and I would probably agree with you, but I don't think that is necessarily what his prerogative is. Lynch sees cinema as a very subjective experience. each viewer seeing a marginally different film based on their own biases and life experience. Therefore, he doesn't show his hand on any of his films out of the desire to preserve that unique experience for everybody, making all views and interpretations equally valid. When you attribute definite words and assert a concrete meaning to a film, it loses its luster, and any mystery that was once there simply vanishes. Lynch has always been very vocal about his love of transcendental meditation, and by his own admission, it has allowed him to dive deep into his consciousness and return with submerged gems. His method of filmmaking is a process of intuitive discovery, using these gems to craft his stories as he goes. Some may prefer harder outlines when telling a story, and see Lynch's method as being contrived. But I would argue that it is effective in a similar way to how Dali and the original surrealists sought to capture an unconscious super-reality within their art. Speaking on the subject of dreams, the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung said that they show us the unvarnished natural truth and are therefore fitted, as nothing else is, to give us back an attitude that accords with our basic human nature when our consciousness has strayed too far from its foundations and run into an impasse. I believe that through his weird, surreal imagery and insistence on individual interpretation, David Lynch attempts to simulate the experience of dreaming through film, insofar as his symbolism can strike a deep chord within us, and like discovering the meaning of a weird dream, unearth truths about ourselves that would have remained buried otherwise. Ultimately, I see Lynch as a filmmaker who harnesses his weirdness and unconventional interests and methods to deliver a truly unique and unforgettable cinematic experience. For years, and hopefully many years to come, Lynch has excelled at highlighting the absurd within the mundane and the darkness lingering under the benevolent surface. If you're about to watch one of his films for the first time, the advice I would offer is to drop any reasonable and analytical approach, because David Lynch simply does not operate on those terms. Just enjoy the ride.
It's the most enjoyable thing to go into another world and discover it and make films. It's so beautiful. But the film ends up being the explanation. That's what's so terrible about press conferences. It's all about the film, not about the words.
This is a nice, normal existence, and you're so strange.
Well, I'm not all that strange, really. And also, everybody beneath a lot of times a calm exterior is, the subconscious, right? And that's where everyone has their little, well, not little, the denizens of the deep and all that. And this film, a lot of people say, is a real sort of subconscious experience. It unearths things that are inside of people. So it's sort of like a dream, the dream theme again too.